Bonjour, bienvenue and good morning, and welcome to not so sunny Limousin, France, although it is still very beautiful. As you can see, the eagle-eyed amongst you may be able to spot that there's a jack stand on the Jolene. That's because I've removed her exhaust for a reason that I'm not going to talk about in this video. That'll all become clear in a couple of videos time, hopefully next week, but maybe the week after, depending on scheduling stuff. But all of that has got me in mind about thinking about restorations and stuff like that. It's got me thinking about all the buzzwords that you see in kind of auction catalogues, and you see on Bring a Trailer, and you see on my YouTube channel. You know, words like restoration and words like barn find and patina and stuff like that. And it occurred to me that I've never seen anybody correctly explain the pros and cons of things like patina. Usually you get very emotional arguments about these things. Oh, I hate patina, da 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 da, all cars should be perfectly restored. If it's not perfect, it shouldn't be on the road, da 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 da, and etc. And vice versa. But people don't actually accurately and explain why they dislike or why they disapprove of patina or why they like patina. So instead of taking an emotional standpoint about it, I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you what it all means and what it all means realistically. And if you are looking for a project, can you have your car patinaed? Is your car able to be patinaed? Or are you better to preserve it? Or would it be a better thing for you to just go full bore and do a full restoration? And what sort of restoration should you do? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is originality, because before we start talking about deviations from originality, we have to cover the original, of course. And what originality actually is there's two types of original vehicle. There is completely museum spec car, incredibly early miles, the sort of thing you see on Bring a Trailer, like totally mint. It's been stored in an air-conditioned bubble, and they're a beautiful, wonderful thing, and they're a beautiful time capsule. But the realities of these cars is that they are virtually unusable, and the reason for that is because not using a car will kill a car as quickly as kind of bad maintenance and that kind of thing. Because as a car sits, the oil runs out from between the oil gaps in the engine, and so that when you restart the car, it's actually metal on metal until it gets its oil pressure up. Added to that, all the seals in the engine and all the gaskets in the engine are going to be completely bone dry. And oh, it's raining. And so as soon as you change the oil in it, because the oil will be old, and you go through it properly, if you don't rebuild the engine, it's going to seep oil from every orifice, and it's going to break down very, very quickly. And so the realities of using a completely original car is that in order to actually use it, you have to ruin that originality by taking it all apart and rebuilding it entirely. I have a few friends that have bought cars from museums, and the undertaking is absolutely huge to get a car in a usable and reliable state. Just because they look like they're brand new doesn't mean they are actually brand new. And things age, and tyres age and things like that. I've seen adverts that say, you know, has the original tyres from new. Those tyres are horrendously dangerous and not roadworthy. There's a reason I changed the tyres on Jolene pretty much immediately after buying her, because she still had the original tyres from the 1960s on her, and they just weren't road safe. The other sort of originality is a more realistic sort of originality, and that is a vehicle that has been maintained with original factory parts. It has a full service history from dealerships. This is a sort of car like a Ferrari that has a Class E certificate, that's got a full Ferrari service history, and it's pretty much the only way that you'd want to own a car that is incredibly fragile like that, is to have a car that has such a comprehensive history to it. and is all original and has always been maintained with original parts that were designed to go on there, and not modified and not messed with, and you have a complete history of its use. So you can tell when it's been off the road for long periods of time and that kind of thing. And in that case, these cars can be incredibly reliable. I've heard of, old front-engine Lamborghinis that have 300, 400,000 miles on them, and the reason is they've been used and maintained and used and maintained. And it's a bizarre thing to say, but a car that has, 200,000 miles on it can actually be more reliable than a car that has 200 miles on it, especially considering age. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is recommissioning, because if you buy an original vehicle, or you buy a barn finder, a car that's been stored in a barn, you will have to do recommissioning. Like I say, any low mileage car, any car that has had lack of use for a long time will require what's called recommissioning. Recommissioning is the minimum work carried out because of lack of use. That term minimum is deceptive, because depending on the car, and depending on what that car, obviously the sort of car it is and the sort of mechanics it has, that minimum can mean many different things. I was recently asked about a Jensen Interceptor that had appeared on the internet for sale, and someone consulted me about it. And I said that the car had been off the road since, the early 80s. And I informed the gentleman, because he was like, "This is so cheap, it's amazing." I'm like, it is cheap. It's like a third of the price of what a really nice Interceptor costs, but it will need a full brake system rebuild. It will need a full fuel system rebuild, including cleaning out all the inside of the tank, probably replacing the pump, all new fuel lines, all new brake lines, probably a full engine rebuild, a full carburetor rebuild, most certainly. It will need new tyres. The list goes on, shock absorbers, all new bushes in the suspension, all that kind of thing, because anything that's rubber that sits will dry rot out and will crack, and even if it looks okay, it can just give way, and it's incredibly dangerous. And so it's cars like that give classic cars this myth of unreliability. Any really well maintained car is massively reliable. But a car that's been off the road for such a long period of time will need an enormous amount of work to get it to a good spec. Even if you didn't touch the bodywork, you didn't touch the interior, you didn't touch the things that people actually think about when they think of a restoration. They think about the stuff they can see. And a lot of old owners of old cars, this is one of the problems you get when a car has been really cheap and then all of a sudden they're worth money, is that the last owner that bought it when it was really cheap, because it was cheap, they tend not to put money in them, and they tend to only put money in the things that you can see. So even if a car looks in really good nick, chances are if it's been really cheap, you've got to be really wary, and it's one of the reasons why like a pre-sale inspection is a really good thing. But like I say, any car that's been not used for long periods of time is going to need a full recommission. Jolene was kind of restored by her last owner, but he did less than 400 miles, 1,000 kilometers-ish, in the 5 years that he owned it. And the reason is, even though he rebuilt the engine, he had the gearbox rebuilt, he replaced nearly all the rubber in the car, he never got a running right, and he lacked the skills, because he was a home mechanic and he didn't have the experience to fully set up a car. And I've now got Jolene set up, but it's been so long since he did the recommissioning that I've actually the other day found a broken gator on one of the spring cans that needs replacing. It's only a rubber gator, they're €5 or something, but it's been so long since he recommissioned her that actually she needs stuff again. And every single thing that's broken on Jolene that I've fixed has been to do with lack of use. So it just shows how quickly a vehicle that is not used and is kept in a warm, dry garage can actually deteriorate. Concours is a word that gets bandied around. Concours is a sort of competition, I suppose. A concours competition is for originality, basically. A car that is as it left the showroom in every single way, for better or for worse. And what I mean by that is, if you get a car from the 1970s, a muscle car, for example, a lot of 1970s muscle cars have some really dodgy paintwork and some really bad chrome work that's like super thin, and the paint's all like cellulite. It's all globby, and there's some very dodgy finishes. And it's very tempting to, when you restore a car, restore it better than new. But that's not what a concours restoration is, or a car that is concours from standard. Concours competitions require you to drive the car in to the concours, or, park or a golf course or wherever the concours is being held under its own power. So there will be two sorts of cars at a concours event. There will be original cars and cars that have had a concours restoration. That means everything is standard, or appears to be completely standard and original. It's a car that's been returned to its originality. There is now a preservation class at many concours competitions, but I'm going to get onto that a little bit later. The concours restorations are incredibly interesting, because restoration means to make something like new, to restore it to its former glory. And there are two sorts of restoration, like I say. There is a restoration where you return a car for better or for worse to how it was when it left the showroom. That means things like reliability modifications aren't done. It means things that we now have, technologies that we now have, that can actually make a car much better, much more fuel efficient, better for the environment, safer, aren't carried out, and the car is as it left the factory when it was new. This, depending on the car, can be a really good thing or a really bad thing. Certain cars, I struggle to believe that it's better to have something that's completely original in some respects, because it can actually make it less usable. And if you want something that's a completely original car that you can just sit at, that's basically a sculpture that doesn't move much, then concours is the way to go. Or if you have a concours car that's a new concours car, that's fine. But a concours restoration, it respects the history of the car, and the history of the car when it was new, in a wonderful, wonderful way. The other sort of restoration doesn't do that, unfortunately. And the downside to the second sort of restoration, which is a restoration where it's what I would call a modified restoration. A modified restoration is where you paint the car the same colour as the original car, but you don't use the same sort of paint. Because of, for instance, environmental rules or that kind of thing. So it's like repainting a car that originally had like a single stage type paint, like a pre-war car, with a new water-based multi-stage sort of paint. It might look similar, it might be the same colour, but it's not the same sort of paint, and so it's not concours. Or redoing a fabric interior that's in bits and redoing it in leather instead. It's a modification because it's not as the car was original when it left the showroom, but it can actually make a car much better. And like I say, if the paint originally wasn't very good, to repaint it with a better quality of paint is a better thing, surely. The problem with that is restorations often get rid of all the history of a vehicle. A concours restoration can lose all the history of a vehicle since it left the showroom, and a modified restoration can even get rid of how it was in the showroom and it becomes something else entirely. But the good side of it is you do end up with a much more usable car, and depending on the car and the quality of the car when it was new, a concours restoration car can be wonderfully reliable if maintained properly, and so can a modified restoration car. There is a dark cloud, and not just the dark cloud that's hanging over me. The word patina tends to bring up a lot of opinions. Patina is the damage of age and the understanding that its neglected state is a part of the vehicle's history and beauty. So a car that was perhaps a barn find, a car that has been kind of used and abused and has got wear and tear because of that. Often the term wabi-sabi comes up, which is a Japanese philosophy, meaning that something can become more beautiful with its age and use, in a very simplified term. But patina can be lovely, and it can be if maintained properly, it can be a lovely thing. But patina is just the damage that is done. How that damage is maintained depends on the owner. And they used to call patina, what was it, gentle decrepitude or something like that. They used to call it in old classic car magazines before patina became the thing. Patina became the buzzword. But patina can look really beautiful. There are people out there who fake patina, which is weird. Faking patina is just bizarre to me. Patina is the thing that happens when you use and love and drive and, you know, use a car as it was intended. Cars wear, and eventually patina becomes too much, and eventually things need restoration, unless it's the sort of car that can be patinaed and maintain its decrepitude. That was it, an air of light decrepitude. That's what classic car magazines used to call it before patina was a thing. But there are cars that can't be patinaed. There are cars that just rot. For instance, the classic minis. Classic minis rot like crazy. They rust, and when they rust, they rot. Later 2CVs, Jolene isn't one of them, thankfully. Jolene is completely rust-free. But later 2CVs rot. Earlier 2CVs are made of different metal, and you'll see a lot of early 2CVs driving around with wearing not much paint at all, and it takes a heck of a lot, just like pre-war cars, to actually rot through that metal, because the metal is full of impurities that just don't rot very well. But also, in the case of pre-war cars, that metal is flipping thick, and if maintained properly, and if cared for properly, those cars can be wonderfully patinaed, and they can be almost paintless, and they still manage to wear that beautifully well without rotting through. But if you have a car from the 1960s, 1970s, they're not going to patina well, because they tend to rot through, and you have to remember that panels rot from the back. So any kind of box section that you have in a car's structure, if you can see rot in the structure, that's rotted through from the inside out. So what you see on the outside is not what's on the inside, and it's like I say, rust's like a toddler. It's when you can't see it that it's doing the most damage, and that's a big issue. And so I think that if you have a beautiful 1970s Alpha or a late 60s Alpha, or a Fiat or anything like that, or an early Mini, a classic Mini should I say, these are cars that need restoration. These are cars that can't be maintained in that air of light decrepitude. They have to be restored, and they have to be looked after, because the point between kind of slight rust and slight issues to big rust and holes, that is a very, very close margin. The other thing I want to touch on is modification, because modification is any deviation from stock. I actually did a full video on modification, but modifications are anything that's not standard to a car, anything that's not Concours. So like I say, a restoration that's superior to the quality of the original components, using superior quality internal fabrics and things like that. Period correct modifications are an awesome thing, and I have a big love for period correct modifications. Period correct modifications are any modification that could have been done when that vehicle was new. or in the lifetime of a vehicle. So for instance, if you have a VW Beetle, there is like there's a 1950s style, there's a 1960s style, there's a 1970s style, and depending on hot rods as well, depending on how long that vehicle has lived, it may have seen numerous different styles and numerous different periods throughout its life. And I think cars that are preserved in a particular time period are very, very cool, be they standard or not. Of course, the sorts of modifications are, performance modifications, aesthetic modifications, be they to your taste or not, reliability modifications. Reliability modifications, there are contemporary reliability modifications such as electronic ignition, but there are also period reliability modifications such as superior brakes on Austin 7s and that kind of thing. Certain cars were lacking in period, and so companies stepped up to the plate, much like a Model T having a water pump fitted. It's an original thing that was done to the car when the car was new. In many cases, you can also get replica period modifications, which are a modern-made thing that looks like a period component, and to me that's totally fine. But it is a modification and it needs to be treated as such, but I don't think modification of classic cars, if done sensitively, is such a bad thing. But some cars get completely modified and completely replicated, such as, for instance, buying a classic Fiat 500 and making it into an Abarth using replica or original Abarth bits. It's no longer an original Fiat 500, but it's not really an Abarth either. But it is, in my opinion, if it's done right and it's done sensitively. The issue I have with completely original cars is that they tend not to be as usable as a car that is fully gone through. And metal fatigue is a real thing. Any car that has been raced, there's no such thing as a concours race car. Any car that has been raced has been kind of crashed and stuff's been replaced on it, because racing a car means beating on a car. And metal fatigue is a real thing. And metal fatigue happens with age, but it also happens through use and wear. And so that car will have had numerous parts replaced through its lifetime. There is no such thing as a completely original racing car, which is bizarre because I see that advertised a lot. And it's quite frankly a lie. Unless it was built as a race car and then never used, and in that case it needs completely taking apart and rebuilding again to be used as a race car, meaning it won't be original anymore. So it's kind of this bizarre duality. It's not a modification per se, but there are people out there building replica cars that are completely as original. So for example, there's a company called Persang, or Pureblood, in Argentina that makes completely as original Bugattis. And many purists and many people who don't drive Bugattis or never owned a Bugatti or have never been in a Bugatti don't like that thought. But there's a bunch of Bugattis out there that can't really be driven anymore in the way that they were designed to, because they're worth too much money, or because they were owned by Pierre Varone, or they were owned and raced by Ettore himself, and so they're just worth too much, and they are too much a piece of history. An original Le Mans D-Type is an incredibly special thing, and I know that the original Le Mans D-Types are still in use, as is Fangio's C-Type. And I would be very hesitant to really use one as intended, because if I wadded it up, I would be removing a piece of history from this world. And because of that, the people that actually make the replica, completely replica, I'm not talking a fiberglass body with a Beetle engine underneath, that's a kit car, that's not a replica. A proper 100% as original kind of concours replica of a car, where a car is completely recreated from scratch because we have the technology to do that, to me is a wonderful, wonderful thing. We can't pretend that they're the original ones by any stretch of the imagination, but if it looks like one and it drives exactly like one, it doesn't have the history, no, but you can actually use it in a way that you can't use the original one. and in that respect, it's very true to the original, and in a way that the original no longer is. And because of that, I kind of like them. I like the fact that, you know, I'll never be able to afford a birdcage Maserati or a D-Type, but actually, if I could afford one, I'd probably go for a replica, and the reason is, I would want to drive it in the way that a D-Type's supposed to be driven, and I couldn't drive an original D-Type in that manner without that niggling thought in the back of my head going, don't crash it, don't crash it, don't crash it. So, yeah. Modification and replication of original parts and modification and replication of cars allows them to be used. And because of that, I don't think it's any bad thing, and I don't think it's a bad word. The latest kind of buzzword, the latest thing that in our classic car world is now preservation. Preservation of cars started with Pebble Beach, opened up because of the whole world of patina and that kind of thing. Pebble Beach opened up this this type of competition in their concours competition that is a preservation trophy. Preservation is the understanding that a vehicle's history did not end the day it drove out of a dealership. And it stops certain cars having their entire history removed, because certain cars weren't born great. You know, there's that saying, some men are born great and others become great. The same is true with cars. The thing I like about preservation is that it takes into consideration some of the period correct modifications that were done to the car since the car has been created. It takes into consideration many times works or repairs that were done to a car, because just because if a car was repaired in 1935 because it was a new car and it got boshed by some other person, or it got gravel rashed in competition and then repaired, that's part of the car's history. It was repaired in an interesting way. And it tells, war wounds tell us the story of the car and the story of the car after it was built, and it makes it not just another Land Rover, it makes it not just another 2CV, it makes it not just another Ferrari. Kind of the preservation and the telling of that story is a lovely, lovely thing. The other thing to consider is that preservation is much more expensive, much more time consuming, and much higher maintenance than a modified restoration or a concours restoration. Preserved cars, you really have to keep on top of them, and because of that, are they quite as usable? I don't know. It all depends on the car, of course, and it all depends on how well it's been preserved and whether it can be preserved. So what's my takeaway from all this? Well, my conclusion, as it were, is that cars are inanimate objects made of wood, metal, plastic and rubber and glass. And it's what we do with them that truly gives them their soul. It's the effort, the passion that people put into them, and what people do with them. Like I say, the stories that come out of them. And there are awesome automotive stories being told and being created even now with cars that have been around for nearly 100 years. A story of Duncan Pittaway, who's a British restorer and racing driver and badass. He's most famous for owning a car called the Beast of Turin. But a few years ago, he restored his Type 35 Bugatti. Then he proceeded to jump in it, drive it through a rainstorm to Monaco, race it in the historic Grand Prix in Monaco, and then drive it home again. What a badass. I mean, that is awesome. And that's an incredible story that would have never been told if the car was, or an incredible achievement that would have never been done if the car was wrapped up in bubble wrap, in a bubble, in a basement, in a heated air-conditioned room somewhere. The Bentley boys did amazing things with their Bentleys because they weren't careful with them, and they treated them like they were designed to be driven. The other day someone told me that they wouldn't park their car next to a garden that had its sprinklers on because they were scared that the car would get raindrops and water droplet marks on the paint. I think that's slightly mental. And if a car is don't get me wrong, if a car is a massively important part of history and car history and history of that make, it needs to be preserved, and it needs to be kind of loved and protected and cared for. History needs to be maintained, and for that, replicas are a lovely thing, because it means we can continue to romp on D-types long after D-types can't be thrashed anymore and can't be driven as they were designed to be driven. But what does that mean to us and our cars, and you know, the realistic cars that most people can actually own? To me, a multi-million euro car that sits on a plinth somewhere in a museum and is an integral part of automotive history is a lovely, lovely thing. But it's not worth, to me, as much as a car like a Land Rover that has delivered food to pigs at 4 o'clock in the morning, that has delivered pregnant women to hospital, that has done the school run, that has been battered, abused and left outside in the snow, and yet defiantly is still here to tell its story. That kind of everyday working class hero of a vehicle, these vehicles of continuous use, these vehicles that have been used every single day and can still be used every single day and can be used as they were intended. To me, these are the real automotive heroes. You know, racing cars are all well and good, and kind of multi-million euro supercars are all well and good, but to me, the Model Ts, like 1 out of every, 120 Model Ts are still on the road. There is over 1 million Model Ts still rolling around this planet defiantly. You know, they were Depression era cars. They were used and abused and left in deserts, and yet they stand defiant, and they are still here, and they are still with us, and they are still supporting us, and they can still take us to the shop or take us to the market, or, you know, people can learn to drive in them, and they can, the everyday stories can still be told with them, and I think that's a truly, truly beautiful thing. To me, whether your car is all original, restored, modified, preserved, or just a kind of a mix of everything like Jolene is here, I hope you enjoy it, because that's the true thing to take away from all this. So go out there and go and make some history. Go make some modern history. Go and do something awesome with your car this summer, and go and make memories and go and make stories to tell. And with that, I'll thank you all for liking, commenting and subscribing. Please be awesome to each other, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye.